What you are seeing is a photograph believed to have been taken during the American Civil War, and from the moment it was made public, it shocked many people. In the image, former President Abraham Lincoln can be clearly seen standing beside General Ulysses S. Grant, two central figures in United States history. However, what makes this photograph truly unusual only becomes clear when viewers zoom in. Standing between Lincoln and Grant is a strange, unfamiliar man, someone whose name does not appear in any official historical records. According to military documents, this soldier had been removed from official lists and was reported missing just days before the photograph was supposedly taken. So who was this man, and why was he standing in a place reserved for the most powerful figures of that moment? To this day, there has been no official confirmation that proves whether this photograph is authentic or a later creation. Yet it is precisely this lack of clear answers that has turned the image into a focal point of public fascination. Before this photograph became a topic of debate, it was never meant to be found at all. There was no search for history, no research project, and no plan to uncover anything unusual. The discovery began in the most ordinary way possible, inside a family home, during a routine cleanup that had nothing to do with the past. Claire Donovan was clearing out the attic of her family house, a space that had not been touched in years and held no special meaning beyond storage. She was not looking for documents, photographs, or forgotten artifacts. Her goal was simple: to sort through old boxes, throw away broken items, and make space. Dust filled the air as she moved aside stacked containers that had been sitting untouched for decades. That was when she noticed an old wooden trunk pushed against the far wall. The trunk did not stand out because of labels or markings, because it had none. There was no name, no date, and no indication of ownership. Its surface showed clear signs of age, with worn edges, cracked leather straps, and a metal latch that had lost its shine. Based on family memory alone, the trunk had likely been passed down through several generations without anyone opening it. It had become part of the background, present but ignored. When Claire opened it, she did not find anything unexpected at first. Inside were old clothes, lace gloves, brittle letters, and small personal items that matched the late 19th century. Most of it felt familiar, the kind of objects many families quietly store away and forget. Near the bottom of the trunk sat a leather photo album, its cover damaged and its pages stiff with age. Claire almost set it aside without opening it. The album appeared ordinary, filled mostly with black and white portraits that matched the style of the time. People posed stiffly, faces serious, backgrounds plain, nothing unusual or striking. Then she reached the final pages. One photograph felt different the moment she touched it. It was not placed directly on the page like the others, but wrapped separately in a thin layer of wax paper. The texture was thicker than expected, and the material did not match the surrounding prints. As she unwrapped it, a faint smell became noticeable, something between dried tobacco and old adhesive. This detail alone raised questions, because photographs from that era rarely carried such a scent. The image was also preserved far better than the others, with less fading and fewer cracks. It was clear that someone had taken extra care to protect this specific photograph. At that moment, Claire still had no reason to believe it mattered. She had no training in history, no background in photography, and no awareness of what she was holding. The photograph only became significant after she paused long enough to truly look at it. What stood out was not a single detail, but the feeling that this image did not belong with the rest. Family records offer no explanation for how or why this photograph was stored separately. There are no letters describing it, no notes referencing its existence, and no mention in any known family documents. This absence of context is important because it suggests the photograph was intentionally removed from normal circulation, not hidden in a locked box, but quietly separated and left untouched. At this stage, none of these details prove anything on their own. There is no official confirmation that the photograph is authentic, and no historical archive lists it. However, similar accounts exist in non-official sources, including family records, alternative historical collections, and unpublished materials that never entered public archives. These sources do not confirm the photograph, but they suggest that stories like this one have surfaced before and then disappeared. What makes this discovery unusual is not just what was found, but how it was found. There was no intention, no preparation, and no attempt to shape the outcome. The photograph entered the story by accident, and accidents often raise harder questions than planned discoveries. If this image was meant to be forgotten, why was it preserved so carefully? And if it was never meant to be seen again, why did it survive at all? The moment the photograph was removed from that attic, its silence ended. But the larger mystery was only beginning, because the image itself would soon challenge something far bigger than family history. The mystery deepens once attention moves away from where the photograph was found and focuses on what the image actually shows. At the center stand Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant, two men whose faces are among the most documented in American history. Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, led the nation through its most violent and divided period between 1861 and 1865, with a central goal that went beyond military victory and focused on keeping the Union from collapsing. In the final months of the Civil War, Lincoln lived under constant pressure, both political and personal, while continuing to resist heavy security. Historical records show that he distrusted rigid protection systems, traveled close to frontline camps, and repeatedly ignored warnings about assassination threats. This behavior created a security gap that historians acknowledge but rarely explain in detail. Standing beside Lincoln in the photograph is Ulysses S. Grant, the commanding general of the Union Army from 1864 onward, and the strategist who forced Confederate General Robert E. Lee to surrender at Appomattox on April 9, 1865. Grant was known for avoiding ceremony, symbolism, and public display, choosing efficiency and results over image. Because of this, Grant rarely appeared in photographs meant to carry symbolic weight. When he did, it was almost always tied to moments of extreme historical importance. Photographs showing Lincoln and Grant together are uncommon, and when they exist, they are linked to decisive events rather than casual encounters. This context matters because it means every person placed in that frame would have been there for a reason. Beyond the identities of the men, the photograph presents a second and far more unsettling problem. The image appears to be in full natural color. The uniforms show deep blue tones, skin tones appear warm and varied, and shadows behave as they would in a modern photograph rather than a tinted print. In 1865, photography was limited to black and white processes, and color photography had not yet been developed or refined. Any color seen in photographs from that era came from hand coloring applied after development, a process that left visible brush marks and uneven shading. The photograph in question shows none of those signs. Initial examinations describe the paper stock as consistent with mid-19th century materials, and the aging patterns match what would be expected from an image over 150 years old. There are no traces of modern ink, chemical interference, or digital manipulation. This creates a contradiction that cannot be easily dismissed. If the photograph were a modern forgery, it would require extreme technical precision and intimate knowledge of period materials. If it were genuine, it would challenge everything historians understand about the technological limits of the time. Experts reviewing the image face a dilemma with no comfortable resolution. Rejecting it as fake requires explaining why it matches historical materials so closely. Accepting it as real requires admitting that unknown methods existed without documentation. The surrounding Union officers add another layer of complexity, as their uniforms match regulation styles and their posture reflects real military presence rather than theatrical posing. Everything about the scene suggests an authentic moment captured without awareness of future scrutiny, and yet, the more accurate the details appear, the harder the image becomes to explain. This unresolved tension forces attention away from technology and toward the people within the frame. If the photograph should not exist, then the figure standing exactly where history leaves no room becomes impossible to ignore. As attention slowly moves away from the technical mystery of the photograph, it begins to settle on a far more human problem that refuses to stay in the background. The longer the image is studied, the clearer it becomes that the most important figure may not be Abraham Lincoln or General Grant at all. It is the man standing between them, a figure whose presence feels deliberate, controlled, and deeply out of place within the historical order of the moment. Photographs from this era were not casual records, especially when they involved the president and the commanding general of the Union Army. Every position in the frame carried meaning, whether it was meant to or not. Lincoln and Grant were men surrounded by structure, rank, and protocol, even in moments that appeared informal. Yet this man stands in a position that protocol does not explain. He is not placed behind them like an assistant, nor off to the side like a minor officer, but directly between the two most powerful figures of the Civil War. That placement alone challenges the idea that he was present by chance. When compared to the other Union officers in the photograph, the differences become more pronounced. The surrounding men wear uniforms that clearly signal rank, achievement, and formal military identity. Their posture is stiff, their expressions fixed, their stance unmistakably ceremonial. The man in the center does not share these traits. His uniform lacks visible insignia, offering no clear indication of authority or position within the command structure. There are no medals, no markings, and no symbols that explain why he would be allowed to stand where he does. His posture also tells a different story. Rather than posing for the camera, he appears alert, balanced, and observant, as if his attention is directed beyond the moment itself. It is the posture of someone assigned a task, not someone invited to be remembered. For Claire Donovan, this detail triggers a reaction that feels more instinctive than analytical. The man's face does not feel unfamiliar in the way strangers usually do. Instead, it carries a sense of recognition that is difficult to place at first, as if her memory is responding before her logic can catch up. She begins comparing the image to photographs preserved in her family collection, unsure of what she is searching for but unable to ignore the pull. Eventually, she finds a later photograph showing a man standing outside a barn decades after the war had ended. He is older, heavier, and dressed as a civilian, yet the structure of the face aligns with unsettling precision. The jawline, the spacing of the eyes, and the shape of the brow match too closely to dismiss as coincidence. The man appears to be her great-great-grandfather, William Donovan, a name that had always existed in family history without resolution. Family stories describe Donovan as someone who served during the war and never came home, but they offered no explanation beyond that. There was no grave, no confirmed death, and no clear account of how or where he disappeared. Official military records list Donovan as a medic assigned to the 104th New York Infantry, a role that placed him near soldiers but far from political power. His service record shows no promotions, no commendations, and no movement beyond his assigned unit. Then the timeline introduces a contradiction that cannot be ignored. William Donovan is officially listed as missing on April 6, 1865, only days before the Confederate surrender at Appomattox. The photograph is dated to April 9th, the same moment that Lincoln and Grant were present to witness the symbolic end of the war. If Donovan disappeared on April 6th, he should not appear anywhere afterward, especially not at the center of such a historic scene. Yet the image places him there with calm certainty. There is no record of his recovery, no explanation of reassignment, and no documentation of injury or death. His file simply ends, as if someone closed it and decided it would not be reopened. This kind of disappearance does not match typical wartime chaos. Even in disorder, the military leaves traces, revisions, and corrections. In Donovan's case, the absence is too complete to feel accidental. Experts studying the image notice another detail that quietly shifts the interpretation. Donovan is not looking toward the camera, nor is he focused on Lincoln or Grant. His gaze appears outward, scanning the space around them as if monitoring the environment rather than participating in the moment. This detail reframes his presence entirely. He does not look like a man included for recognition or honor. He looks like someone positioned with purpose. Medics were not placed beside presidents during surrender ceremonies. Unknown soldiers were not allowed to stand between the president and the commanding general, unless their role existed outside public recognition. At this point, the photograph stops being a visual anomaly and becomes a question of intent. Why would a man officially listed as missing appear in such a precise and meaningful position? Why would his presence be undocumented yet carefully preserved? Why would his posture suggest vigilance rather than ceremony? Each question leads to another gap in the record. Each gap suggests a decision rather than an oversight. The image does not offer answers, but it clearly points toward one conclusion. William Donovan was not lost to history by chance. He was removed quietly, intentionally, and completely, which leads to the most troubling question of all. If someone had the authority to erase a man from the record while placing him at the center of history, what kind of role requires that level of silence? Once the question of identity emerges, attention naturally turns toward the official military records that should explain what happened to the man in the photograph. At first, the expectation is simple, because armies are built on paperwork, and even during wartime chaos, records tend to leave traces. Researchers begin by searching for standard reports related to William Donovan, expecting to find either confirmation of death, reassignment orders, or discharge papers. None of those documents appear. There is no battlefield death report tied to his name, no burial record, and no casualty notice sent to family members. There is also no documentation showing that he was transferred to another unit, even temporarily. Equally troubling, there is no discharge certificate, which would normally exist even if a soldier left service under unclear circumstances. Instead, Donovan's file simply stops after April 6, 1865, as if his presence in the system ended without explanation. This absence becomes more disturbing when compared to how the Union Army normally handled missing personnel. Even soldiers listed as missing in action usually generated follow-up reports, inquiries, or later updates when new information surfaced. In Donovan's case, none of those processes seem to have occurred. His name does not reappear in later reconciled lists, pension reviews, or post-war corrections. It is as if the system accepted his disappearance without question. Historians familiar with Civil War bureaucracy note that such clean breaks are rare. Even under pressure, clerks documented uncertainty, confusion, and incomplete information. A file that simply ends suggests intervention rather than neglect. As researchers move beyond the main archive, they begin to find scattered references that do not appear in official summaries. These include marginal notes, handwritten annotations, and informal correspondence that were never fully cataloged. One such reference hints at a quiet reassignment approved outside normal command channels. The note does not specify a destination, rank, or duration. It simply states that Donovan was moved out of his regiment shortly before the end of the war. Crucially, this movement does not appear in any centralized system. It exists only as a side remark, detached from the formal structure of military reporting. For viewers unfamiliar with 19th-century record-keeping, this distinction matters. The Union Army relied on layered documentation, meaning orders flowed through multiple offices before becoming official. Anything that bypassed that process would leave minimal trace. Such actions were rare, but not impossible, especially during the final weeks of the war when urgency often overrode procedure. This context opens a narrow but significant possibility. Donovan may not have been lost or forgotten. He may have been deliberately removed from the visible structure of the army. Not dismissed, not punished, and not promoted, but quietly reassigned into a space where records were intentionally thin. This theory aligns uncomfortably well with his appearance in the photograph. A man removed from formal roles would not carry rank or insignia. He would not appear in ceremonial documentation. Yet he could still be present where he was needed most. The absence of records begins to feel less like an error and more like a design. Someone had the authority to move him without explanation. Someone ensured that his name would not resurface after the war ended, and someone allowed his role to dissolve into silence while preserving the image that proved he had been there. At this stage, the mystery no longer centers on whether the photograph is unusual. It centers on why the system around it appears incomplete. The missing paperwork does not erase Donovan. The missing paperwork does not erase Donovan from history, but instead draws attention to the careful silence built around him. And as the official record fades away, the focus naturally shifts toward the hidden signs that suggest his role may have existed outside any system meant to be seen. The final layer of this story does not come from a battlefield report or a forgotten archive, but from a quiet decision made inside a family long before anyone expected the photograph to resurface. Among the items preserved with the image was a letter that carried none of the warmth or nostalgia usually found in family correspondence, but instead read like a warning written by someone who understood the danger of memory. The letter did not explain events, name people, or describe motives, and it did not attempt to justify what had been done. It gave a single instruction, clear and unsettling, that the photograph was never meant to be kept and should be destroyed if it was ever discovered. That instruction changes how the entire photograph must be understood. Objects that are meaningless do not require secrecy, and harmless artifacts are not passed down with fear attached to them. The photograph was not hidden because it lacked value, but because revealing it too early could have carried consequences that were better avoided through silence. This explains why the image was preserved carefully rather than discarded, sealed rather than displayed, and stored away instead of being shared as a family story. Someone made a deliberate choice to let time protect the truth instead of exposure. When viewed this way, the photograph begins to feel less like a historical record and more like a message delayed until the world was ready to look at it without immediate risk. It does not try to convince, accuse, or explain, but simply exists as proof that something happened and that someone once stood in a place history never acknowledged. The silence surrounding William Donovan no longer feels accidental in this context, because silence itself may have been part of his role rather than the result of failure or neglect. He was not erased because his service lacked importance, but because recognition would have defeated the purpose of what he was asked to do. The photograph survives not to rewrite history, but to remind us that some truths were never meant to be loud, only preserved until time itself made them safe to see. The photograph linked to William Donovan belongs to a larger pattern of images that exist in history without clear explanation. Across different decades and countries, there are photographs that were never meant to shock, yet quietly unsettled everyone who later studied them. One of the earliest examples is the Cooper family falling body photo, taken in England in 1970 during a normal family gathering. When the photo was developed, a human figure appeared to be falling from the ceiling, even though no one in the room witnessed anything unusual at the time. No evidence of photographic manipulation using the technology of that era has ever been confirmed. Another widely discussed case is Solway Firth Spaceman, which shows a young girl standing in a field while a figure resembling a suited observer appears behind her. NASA later stated that the figure did not resemble any known civilian clothing of the period, although alternative explanations continue to divide experts. In the chaos surrounding the assassination of President Kennedy, the figure known as the Babushka Lady appears calmly filming near the scene and never fleeing. Despite appearing in multiple recordings, her identity and footage were never recovered by authorities. Earlier still, the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall shows a female figure on a staircase in a photograph taken by professional photographers in 1936. Experts at the time found no sign of deliberate staging. Not all mystery photographs rely on visual strangeness, as seen in Vulture and the Little Girl, where the unanswered questions center on ethics rather than imagery. Even space offers its own unresolved image through Black Knight satellite, officially labeled debris, yet still debated decades later. Together, these photographs reveal a consistent truth that sometimes the image survives while the explanation disappears. This photograph, Donovan, may never be fully confirmed as real, but it raises questions that history has never clearly answered. It brings together Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, and a man who should not have been there, yet appears at the center of a critical moment. The missing records, the unusual details, and the silence left behind all point to gaps in the official story of the Civil War. Whether this image is truth or mystery, it reminds us that history is not only made by famous names, but also by people whose roles were hidden on purpose.